Ready for a deep dive, everybody. This time we're tackling the book of Genesis, but we're going way deeper than the surface level here.
Yeah, we're talking about some seriously fascinating insights, drawing on Jewish tradition and the early church fathers.
Stuff you probably haven't heard before.
What I find really interesting is the sheer depth of analysis we can do. Like using the original Hebrew and the historical context, we uncover layers of meaning that honestly often get missed in translation.
So not your typical Sunday school lesson then, huh?
Definitely not.
All right, then. So we're talking interpretations from Jewish tradition, the church fathers. This is serious stuff.
Yeah.
What would you say is the mission of this deep dive? What do we want our listeners to walk away with?
Our mission really is to give you the knowledge, give you the tools to engage with Genesis on a whole new level, for your own personal study, for teaching, or even if you just want to go deeper with this really foundational text.
I love it. Deeper understand it. That's what we're all about. Okay, so let's get to it. Genesis 1.1, probably the most famous opening line in history. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Seems pretty straightforward, right?
You'd think so, right? But trust me, that first sentence, it's like an onion, layers upon layers of meaning that we often just skim right over.
Okay, now you've got me hooked. Tell me more. What kind of hidden depths are we talking about?
The Hebrew language, it has this incredible richness to it. Take the word for beginning, reshit. It also carries the meaning of the firstborn, specifically talking about a firstborn son who inherits authority.
Hold on. Is this about Jesus? Like how Colossians calls him the firstborn of all creation. Are we saying there's a connection there even back in Genesis?
You got it. It's like the very first words of Genesis are subtly pointing towards Jesus' role, even in the Old Testament. And it doesn't stop there either. The Hebrew word for God here, Elohim, it's plural. It's like a little hint right from the start about the Trinity.
Whoa, hold up a sec. Are we saying that the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, they're all present, woven into the creation account?
Absolutely. And we can see their fingerprints all over it. Let's start with the Holy Spirit, that image of God's Spirit hovering over the waters in Genesis 1 and point 2. Think about this, the Hebrew word for wind, breath, and even spirit. It's all the same word, roch.
Isn't that like at Jesus' baptism?
Mm-hmm.
Are you drawing a line between those events?
You're right on the money. Early church fathers, guys like St. Jerome, they saw this parallel, this connection between God's Spirit at the very first creation and then at the new creation that we experience through baptism. Beautiful, isn't it?
Wow. Okay, I'll be honest. I never thought about it that way before. This is blowing my mind, which is what these deep dives are all about. Okay, so we've got the Spirit, but what about Jesus? Where's the Son in all of this?
Think about how John's gospel refers to Jesus, the Word, right? Now think about what God does throughout Genesis. He speaks things into existence. God said, and bam, creation unfolds. It's powerful.
So are we saying that God speaking creation is like his word, which is like Jesus actively creating?
Exactly. It's like this incredible tapestry where even the smallest details are pointing to the Trinity's involvement in creation. And it all starts right here in these seemingly simple verses of Genesis.
Okay, I need a minute to process all this Trinity stuff. It's amazing. But while I do that, what about all the debates about the 6 days of creation? Where did those fit into all of this?
That's where things get even more interesting. The Catholic Church, it doesn't actually require you to believe in 6 literal 24-hour days of creation. There are tons of interpretations of this passage.
So it's okay to hold different views on how long creation took.
Totally. What the church says is that God created everything, the universe, all life, everything, and he gave us humans, immortal souls. But how he did it and the exact timeline, that's open to different interpretations. You have people who hold on to that 6-day view and others who find the day-age theory really compelling.
Where each day could be like millions of years of geological time. I've heard that one.
Exactly. But there's also the gap theory, the framework hypothesis.
Yeah.
You've got symbolic interpretations too. The point is you've got the freedom to explore these different views and see which one clicks for you, which one lines up with your own reading of the text and, let's be real, the scientific evidence too.
So instead of us telling everyone this is the right way to see it, we're giving them the tools to understand these different arguments and come to their own conclusions.
Exactly.
I like it. Speaking of different views, you mentioned the framework hypothesis earlier. What's that one all about?
Okay, so the framework hypothesis, it's interesting, really. This view was popularized by a scholar named Meredith Kline, and it proposes that instead of 6 consecutive days, Genesis 1 is actually structured around 2 sets of 3 days. It's highlighting a literary structure rather than a strict timeline.
Okay, now I'm really intrigued.
So the first 3 days, they set up these fundamental realms: time, space, and life.
Got it, like the foundation. And then the next 3 days are when God fills those realms.
Exactly. Day and night, they fill time, birds and fish fill space, and then you've got land animals and finally humans filling that realm of life. It's pretty cool when you think about it. God creates these realms and then populates them with rulers, and it all leads up to humanity as the peak of creation.
I've got to say, that is a really cool way to look at it. Never thought about it like that before. It makes me think that maybe, just maybe, Genesis isn't trying to give us a science textbook, you know?
Yeah.
Maybe he's trying to tell us something much bigger.
That's it, exactly. And that's the beauty of really digging into Genesis, isn't it? We find these layers of meaning that are about something way deeper, way more profound. It's stuff that still connects with us today, even after all these years.
Okay, more layers, bring them on. But before we do, what about the guy who wrote all this? We always hear the book of Moses. Did Moses actually write Genesis?
Now, there's a question that people have been debating for centuries. The traditional view, the one that's been around the longest, supported by Jewish and early Christian tradition, is that Moses did write the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, including Genesis.
And we do have verses in the Bible that seem to back that up.
We do. But then you have the documentary hypothesis, which says that the Pentateuch is actually a bunch of sources, all cobbled together, written way after Moses was around.
Right, the whole JEDP theory. It does sound a little like alphabet soup. But you said there are problems with that theory, right?
The biggest problem is that we don't actually have any proof.
Yeah.
Literally no ancient documents that match these supposed sources. It's kind of a head scratcher. And even among scholars who do like the documentary hypothesis, nobody can agree on which parts of the text belong to which source. It's a mess.
So it's a theory that's still a work in progress, you could say.
Okay, so if we're sticking with the traditional view that Moses wrote Genesis, why should we care? What makes it important for us today? Why should we listen to a book written thousands of years ago?
Because Genesis, it's not just some ancient history book gathering dust on a shelf. This is the foundation of our faith. This book lays out these core truths about who God is, the nature of creation, humanity's place in it all, the reality of sin, and the hope of redemption. It's huge.
So bottom line, what does this all mean for us today? What are those big themes in Genesis that we're still wrestling with? It's amazing, right? This book, written so long ago, still speaks to these huge questions we're dealing with today, like that whole idea of dominion. God gives it to humanity over the earth, but what does that actually mean? Do we own the earth, free to do whatever?
Right.
Or are we more like caretakers, stewards of God's creation? Yeah, that tension between ownership and stewardship, it's more relevant now than ever, especially with climate change and all the environmental concerns. But Genesis, it gives us this framework for understanding our responsibility to care for the planet, not to just take advantage of it.
Yeah. It's a huge responsibility when you really think about it. And then there's that whole idea of covenant, which, it starts with God's covenant with Adam. It's this sacred bond, almost like, a family.
And that covenant idea, it just echoes throughout the whole Bible. Even when we mess up, God keeps making covenants, promising to redeem us, to restore things. It shows just how faithful he is, even when we're not.
That's like this constant reassurance. Even when we screw up, he's still there, working to make things right. Man, this deep dive is really opening my eyes about Genesis. It's not just stories. It's about creation, our purpose, and redemption, God's faithfulness.
And we can't forget about the fall, Adam and Eve taking the fruit. That whole event, it brings in this idea of sin and all the ripple effects it had on humanity.
Right? That break in our relationship with God, it just seems to echo through every generation. And that brings us back to baptism, doesn't it? That whole thing about baptism being a kind of recreation, wiping the slate clean and bringing us back into God's family.
Exactly. Genesis, it lays the groundwork for understanding why we need redemption and how we get it through Christ. And then baptism, it becomes this beautiful symbol of new life, a return to that original covenant. It's powerful.
Wow. It's all coming together now. Creation, covenant, the fall, redemption. It's all woven together.
You know what really struck me earlier? When you talked about the first few verses of Genesis, those first few verses, and how they hint at the order of the Trinity, like God the Father first, then the Spirit, then God the Son as the Word. It's a different order than we usually think about. You picked up on that. Nice. Even these little details in Genesis, they matter. And you're right, that order, it's different. But check this out. That same order in Genesis 1.13, you see it again in Revelation 1.4 to 5. It talks about grace and peace coming from him who is and who was and who is to come, then the seven spirits, and then Jesus Christ.
So maybe it's not about, like, who's higher up in the Trinity. Maybe it's about the different ways God interacts with creation and with us.
That's a really good point. It speaks to that dynamic way God is present in our lives, the same way he was active and involved in creation itself.
This deep dive is showing me so much I never knew. Like you said, it's about these hidden layers. Are there any other, like, aha moments waiting for us in Genesis?
Of course, there are tons. For example, think about that phrase, God saw that it was good. It's repeated throughout the creation account.
How many times?
7 times.
7. The number of perfection. You see what you did there?
Exactly. It's highlighting the goodness of everything God created. Everything has a purpose, a meaning. It wasn't just random.
That's a powerful message, especially these days. It's easy to forget that God saw it all and called it good.
And it all leads up to Genesis 1.31, where God sees everything he made, and it's very good. That's like the climax of creation building up to the creation of humanity.
Like a symphony reaching its crescendo, and then boom, the fall happens.
It does. And it's important to remember that the fall wasn't just about breaking a rule. It was about humans wanting to be like God, trying to decide what's good and evil for themselves.
That whole thing of playing God, it's still a thing, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. Understanding Adam and Eve's story helps us see our own tendency to sin, to think we know better. And it shows us how much we need a savior.
Okay, I need a minute to process all this. We've covered so much already. Trinity stuff, the number 7, all these different views on creation.
And we're just getting started. There's still a ton more to discover in Genesis.
Okay, well, don't leave me hanging. You mentioned the Hebrew word bara before. Something about its importance in relation to creation.
Oh, yeah. Bara. It means to create, but it's only used with God as the subject. And it pops up 7 times in Genesis chapter 1.
There's that number again.
Right. It emphasizes how unique and powerful God's creative acts are.
So every time we see bara, it's like a special kind of creation. Totally different from anything else.
Exactly. And it's even more important when it's talking about the creation of humanity. Like in Genesis 1.27, bara is used 3 times. It's emphasizing the dignity and significance of humans made in God's image.
Yeah, and that's where we see that first covenant, right? God's not just the creator anymore. He's like a father now, sharing his life with us.
You got it. Genesis, it sets the stage for seeing the whole Bible as the story of God and his kids. It's a family affair, the whole thing.
And we're a part of it.
Yeah.
It blows my mind. But being made in the image of God, what does that actually mean? How can we be anything like God?
People have been asking that question for ages. It doesn't mean we physically look like God, that's for sure. It's about our ability to love, to reason, to be creative, to make moral choices. Those are reflections of God built into us.
So those things in us, they're like little pieces of God.
Exactly. We were created to show God's glory, to take care of creation, and most importantly, to love him and each other.
That's a pretty tall order.
Yeah.
And honestly, we haven't exactly lived up to it.
That's true. But that's where the gospel comes in. Jesus redeems us. He brings us back to that relationship with God that sin messed up. And it all starts with baptism, that amazing act of new creation, being reborn into God's family.
Full circle, man. Full circle. From that first creation to the new creation of baptism, I'm starting to see how the whole Bible is connected, with Genesis as the foundation.
That's what happens when you see the Bible as one big story. Each book sheds light on the others, showing us who God is and his amazing plan for us.
Man, I'm hooked on Genesis now. What else is there? What other gems are we going to dig up?
Let's talk about the Sabbath. It's not just about taking a break. It's about entering into God's rest. A day to be with him,
So it's like a taste of that eternal rest we'll have in heaven, being totally united with God.
Exactly. The Sabbath was also this reminder, a tangible reminder of God's covenant with Israel, a sign of their special relationship with him.
And now we have the Lord's Day Sunday, celebrating Jesus' resurrection. It's our new day of rest, celebrating the new creation. It all connects.
It does, and it all goes back to Genesis, the book that lays the foundation for everything we believe.
Man, I am loving this deep dive. This has been amazing. What's next on our Genesis adventure? What else are we going to uncover? There's so much more to unpack. We've barely scratched the surface, really, of those early stories. The garden, the fall, Cain and Abel, the flood, even the Tower of Babel. Those aren't just like children's stories, right?
Oh, absolutely not. They're packed with symbolism and meaning that's still so relevant for us today.
It's like they're tapping into something really deep about what it means to be human.
Exactly. They offer insights into the human condition, our relationship with God, temptation, sin, the consequences of our choices. It's all there.
Let's take the Garden of Eden, for example. It's not just about a nice garden, is it? What's the deeper meaning there?
The garden symbolizes that initial harmony, humanity and God, man and woman, humanity and nature, all in perfect balance. It represents that original blessing, the ideal we were created for.
And then, boom, the fall. What does that tell us about ourselves and about God, that we couldn't just leave well enough alone?
The fall, it wasn't just about disobeying a rule. It was about humans wanting to be like God, wanting that knowledge of good and evil, deciding their own destiny. It's still a temptation today, isn't it? That desire for autonomy, for control, even if it means going against God.
All the time.
Yeah.
How often do we try to do things our own way, thinking we know better than God?
And the consequences, well, they're all around us. Broken relationships, chasing power and wealth, exploiting the earth. It's like echoes of that first break, that separation from God.
Which brings us to those other stories, like Cain and Abel, the flood, the Tower of Babel. Are those also about this tension between obeying God and wanting to do our own thing?
Exactly. Cain killing Abel, driven by envy and rage. That's what happens when we let that desire for control run wild. And the flood, it's this stark image, a reminder of what happens when sin just takes over, when humanity as a whole rejects God.
And the Tower of Babel, what about that one?
Human ambition gone wrong, trying to build our way to heaven, literally making a name for ourselves apart from God. It's like a warning, right? Don't put your trust in human ingenuity alone. Don't strive for your own glory. Seek God's will instead.
It's incredible how these ancient stories still speak to us, even after all these years. Our struggles, our temptations, our search for meaning, it's all there.
That's the power of Genesis. It's timeless. It speaks to something deeper, something that goes beyond culture and time.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Genesis, at least for now, what's the one thing you want our listeners to take away? What's the big question?
As you go about your week, I want you to think about this. How does understanding Genesis creation, the fall, God's covenant with us, how does it all shape how you see yourself, how you see the world, and how you see your relationship with God? Let these ancient stories guide you, help you understand your place in this incredible story.
That's a powerful thought. To let these stories, these ancient stories, shape our perspective, our values, even our lives. This has been an amazing journey. Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you to all our listeners for joining us on this deep dive into the book of Genesis. We'll see you next time.